So I'm really pleased today to welcome Dr. Gerry Bigelow here to our speaker series. Thinking that I met Gerry like maybe 25 years ago when I was a student and aspiring still to be an archaeologist, which I've appear to have miserably failed at. We're really pleased to have him here to talk about the work that he's been doing for many years in the Shetlands. And Gerry comes to us from Bates College, where he's an associate professor of history. He's been doing archaeological work in the Shetlands and other parts of the north, like Greenland, for the last 40 years. And his research actually has kind of covered that whole area of the North Atlantic. And we first met through an organization called the North Atlantic Cultural Organization, and I was introduced to Gerry and many of his colleagues and many of my colleagues now through a mutual friend of ours, Priscilla Renouf. So Gerry directs the Shetland Island Climate and Settlement Project. I should put my glasses on. Which is research that's focused on the interaction between climate change and North Atlantic societies. Understanding that relationship guides his interests in North settlement and trade and social expression through architecture. And so I'm going to turn it over to Gerry. I know he has some interesting stuff to talk about and some incredible slides, so I'm really pleased that the room keeps filling up. Yay, it's great. Okay, all you. And I think you're mic'd and ready to go.
Yep. Can everybody hear me okay? Yep. Okay, good. Well, thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. I particularly like to come to Canada to give a talk on this project for a reason that has to do with Shetland history. And that is the population of Shetland reached a peak in the early 1860s. There were 32,000 people there, and the islands were covered with little farming communities like this. But by the 1960s, the population had dropped to 17,000. So there was kind of a diaspora from the islands. And at that time and today, you can still see hundreds of these roofless stone croft houses that date back to that time when the population was high. And when people left, some came to the United States, but not that many. Instead, most of them emigrated to Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. And so when I give a talk in Canada, I think that there may be a chance that there are people with some Shetlandic background, family background here. And if so, I hope this talk will resonate with you. I thought it would be helpful for those of you who are not familiar with the islands to basically describe it as a place first. It is out in the middle of the ocean, almost equidistant from the west coast of Norway and from the northern tip of the mainland of Scotland. And as you see from the statistics down below, it's on the same latitude as northern Labrador or southern Greenland, but it's quite warm for that latitude. And that is partly it's because it's not surrounded by land, it's out in the ocean, and partly because it's bathed by the North Atlantic Current, which is the eastward extension of the Gulf Stream. And it is an archipelago of about 100 islands, although this is actually one big island. It's connected by a very narrow bit of land right there. And if you go there and you travel around the islands, one thing that will impress you immediately is, for a small place, it has a huge amount of coastline. It's deeply indented, and another thing that will impress you is that coastline is iron-bound in many respects. There are long stretches of sea cliffs in Shetland of different heights. Some of them are really spectacularly high. And they were formed by the fact that the Shetland is in the path of westerly storm tracks, and so a lot of high-energy storms hit this coast. If you look right at this area, this is a detail of that area in one of those storms. So it's a windy place in general. Particularly this time of the year, it's a windy place. That's something to consider if you decide to go there, because the options are to fly or to take the overnight ferry from Aberdeen, which can be a very different experience. There are parts of the coastline, though, that are very gentle in their topography, and those are places that often are covered with green vegetation that's the result of being used for farming for 6,000 years. Much of the islands are also covered with deep peat deposits, and so peat moorland is a very obvious part of the island's ecology. And it's a place that's had a lot of economic importance to Shetlanders. It has some things in common with tundra. It has reindeer moss. It has bog cotton growing on it. But it's been very important as a source of fuel for heating because there are no trees in Shetland. Paleobotanists say that Shetland was forested once before humans came, but I came here from Maine, and from our perspective, trees that are under 3 meters high don't qualify as being forest. And certainly after people arrived and they brought domestic animals, that wasn't the case. But peat is something that has always been really critical to survival there. The landscape has been very strongly shaped by grazing animals, particularly sheep. And the native breed of sheep, Shetland sheep, are little small animals. There are not that many of them grown today because they don't produce that much wool, although it's very fine wool, and they don't produce that much meat. And so improved breeds of sheep from the south were introduced quite a while ago, and they require much more care in their raising. And they can't live out on the moorland, which the Shetland sheep can do. They can outwinter all winter long on the moorland. Shetland ponies also can survive out on the moorland during winter gales when its wind is blowing 90 miles an hour. And they formerly were very important as work animals. They were used largely as pack animals, also for light plowing. Today, they're pets. In terms of the potential for human settlement, the land there had limited productivity. The surrounding seas had almost unlimited productivity. Fish, certainly, this is a place that has been exploited for both subsistence and commercial fishing for thousands of years, but also seabirds. Thousands and thousands of migratory seabirds come to Shetland every year. And unfortunately, familiar story, the numbers of certain types are dropping, including puffins, because there are apparent mismatches between the sand eels that puffins feed to their young and other types of small fish that their young cannot eat, and in effect, their numbers are dropping catastrophically at this point. The islands also have a very rich settlement history and a very rich archaeology. In a place where there weren't trees for building, almost all the building was done in stone. And so the settlement sites tend to be both conspicuous and sometimes well preserved. This is a truly amazing site that dates from 500 BC to up until the 1800s, but they're the remains of 22 separate houses that are all glued together around this big structure here, which is the remains of a type of fortified house called a broch. And Shetland also has the best preserved broch in Scotland, 40 feet high, and there are over 95 of these known in Shetland, which is a testimony of the fact that large numbers of people have lived in these islands at various points down through the millennia. Now, up until 800 AD or so, the period when this site was occupied, which is very close to that one I showed you before, we think that Celtic people were living there. There's debates about this ethnic label for the people who were there, but people called the Picts by the Romans. were living here. But then in the 800s, Vikings, very, very likely from northwestern, or for the west coast of Norway, arrived. And you can actually see it in the architecture on this site. Ignore this. This is a 16th century house here. But these round houses are all from before 800 AD. And then when the Vikings arrived, long houses, rectilinear houses were being built there. And that continued to be the tradition after that point. And Shetland belonged to Norway from, it literally was like a county of Norway from 1195 until the 1400s. And in 1468, it was actually pawned to the Scottish kingdom as part of a dowry for a Danish princess, and has remained in Scottish hands since that time. And so you can see things that look very familiar from mainland Scotland in the islands that come from that influence. Now, let's get to the science that's at the heart of the talk today. I became interested in a specific research question when I first started working in Shetland in the late 1970s. And I directed the excavation of a site right here on a sandy beach. Much of the sand deposits had been blown away by this point. But the purpose of the excavation was to uncover a medieval farmstead. And I knew that there was one there because you could see artifacts on the surface of the sand that were from that period. But while we were working there, we also found two burials from the Pictish period that dated to the 400s. And they had been built on an earlier surface of this dune, then were buried in sand, windblown sand, and then the medieval farmstead was abandoned in the 1350s, and that was buried in sand. And around this time, the pioneering climate historian H.H. Lamb published the first global climate history. And in that, he specified that he looked and saw that there was a pattern in archaeological sites and evidence of settlements being buried in sand at particular periods. And in particular, he specified between AD 400, 700 and 1300 to 1700. And this fit the pattern on this site quite well. Furthermore, he thought that these mass sand movements were caused by an increase in storms, the intensity of storms. And then beyond that, he thought that the storminess was correlated with periods of sharp climatic cooling, and of course, that really fit the whole concept of the Little Ice Age. So I became interested in this general model, and it's something that he derived by looking at a variety of places on North Sea coasts and around the coasts of Scotland, and places like Jutland in Denmark, where this is a fairly famous place where a medieval church has, at intervals, been buried in the excavated, and it gets buried in windblown sand. It's surrounded by dunes. So ultimately, I was able to form a project to pursue this idea, and it continued in various forms for a number of years. In 2010, we got a large grant from the National Science Foundation, the U.S. National Science Foundation. I was able to put together a really big team of people who had different skills to try to help us understand this whole process better. And we decided to look at a particular case that might be instructive, and that involved a settlement called Bru, which is in the southernmost part of Shetland, which in the mid-1500s was supposed to be one of the most valuable properties in the Shetland Islands. But there was an account from 1774 that described it as having been completely buried in sand and destroyed by sand blowing in from a beach. And says here, the traveler is scarce to be seen for the drifting sand riding to church. Well, at that time, the church was down in this area, and there are accounts of people, wiping the sand off the pews of the church, and finally they abandoned that one and they built a new one. So we knew it had been this township, it was gone by 1774. And what you see here is light-colored vegetation is where This is a big dune field, and it actually extended over in here. This has all been modified by agriculture. And we know that a community of 4 farms was destroyed by this, this incursion of sand from the beach. And this is what the beach looks like today. It's actually very attractive. But on the other side of the big foredune, there are just all of these smaller dunes that are now covered with marram grass. And we think that's where there were fields of barley and oats back in the 1500s. 2003, we located 2 sites, or 2 parts of one settlement right here, well inland from the beach, but you can see the dunes here. And this is what they looked like in 2004. They were just mounds, and there were stone enclosures that you could see in the landscape. Another thing to see about the landscape is these are all the castings from rabbit burrows. There are thousands of rabbits in this environment. They may have played a role in the disaster as well. So this is just, there's an enclosure here. I think there's a house here, but I think this was an agricultural building, and the main farmhouse was in here. And so we've been working on this now for off and on for quite a few years, but in 2013 we had uncovered two buildings with kind of an organized space between them, and as you can see, they're very well preserved. We have intact window openings, and there's one place where the wall, a gable wall, may be standing 4 meters high. And I've taken students there from the University of Southern Maine twice and from Bates College 5 times, and this May we'll go back, another class from Bates College. This kind of archaeology is not what I ever thought I'd be doing, because what we're interested in is buried under 6 feet of sand. And so with the advice of the local archaeology authority, I finally just hired power equipment to come in to move a lot of it for us. Oops. Right. We have some historical records of this event, which adds to the interest here. And an historian at Bates College, Michael Jones, has been analyzing them, and from those, it appears that the first onset of sand in this disaster occurred sometime between 1630 and 1684. Geologists here may be thinking, the Maunder Minimum, period of cooling climate. And that the township was declared worthless for taxation by 1706. So just the historical records kind of narrow down parts of the disaster narrative. Now, the buildings that we found may have a real story to tell too. We think that when this farm started, it consisted of these 2 buildings that were side by side. And then these walls were built here to create kind of a controlled space between them. We use the term courtyard, although I think it's a little rarefied for the actual space. But then later on, this room was built on the end of this house, and it's really different in character. The walls are a little thicker, the masonry work is finer. That's the room that was added. But what's really extraordinary about it is it has what for Shetland criteria, it has a huge fireplace. And you can't see it very well here because a lot of it is decayed. These walls are not made out of mortared stone. They're dry-laid masonry with some clay in them, which would have made building a fireplace like this really a challenge. But on either side of it, there were little boxes built into the walls that in the Shetland dialect are called gligs on either side of the fireplace. And that is something that you see in elite buildings from the period, like castles. There are actually 2 castle ruins. This is Britain's northernmost castle. There's a glig, there's one there. And then Scalloway Castle, you can't see them very well, but they also have matching ones on either side. And so that alone suggests that the people who were living there when that room was built on may have been quite prosperous people, or they were used to being prosperous. The artifacts also suggest that really what happened was the owners of this whole township, and the family, they were Sinclairs. They're a very wealthy family in Shetland, that they may have taken over this farm from tenants as the sand was advancing inland, built that room on, and what it looks like is, it looks like a little castle hall in its arrangements, including that fireplace. But they were using things, they were buying and using consumer items that were expensive in the period, including pottery, like this is a fragment of a kind of Delft plate that's called a Merryman plate. They came in sets of 6. And we hope that we find the rest of this plate, because in many cases they actually painted the year of manufacture in the middle of the plate. I was in Bergen, Norway last June studying artifacts, and they were rebuilding one of the Hanseatic warehouses and places of business on the waterfront there, and they had a little display of artifacts they'd found in doing archaeological work around the foundations of it, and I immediately saw another one of these plates, which would have been the trash from probably a very prosperous Hanseatic merchant. So we think that this house was lived in by the lairds in its last iteration. The artifacts from this period are fun to study, because by this time there was global trade, and there were artifacts were being produced for specific markets, and they often the styles changed quickly. So you combine that with other kinds of evidence that can be quite good for dating. And also the ornamentation, sometimes you just find a small fragment and you can, you know what you've got. This is the oldest artifact that we've dated from this site, from the mid-1600s so far. And there are other things that give us hints about how the site was abandoned. We found so far one fragment of a roof slate. And slate roofs were very uncommon in Shetland at this time period. But we've only found one fragment, and that's definitely what it is, which would indicate that they probably salvaged the whole roof and took most of it off site. And that got broken in the process. But in 2 different places on the site, we have found whole panes of glass that have fallen out of windows and landed on the ground and broke. And glass also would have been an expensive commodity at that time. And you have to ask, why didn't they salvage that? And then also, there's just some interesting artifacts. We've only uncovered one section of the floor in the main house so far. When we go back in May, that's what we're going to do first. But we found this comb just resting on a flagstone. And we found these other artifacts, and I thought they were probably all made from reindeer antlers, something like that. And when they came back from the conservatory, we discovered they're all made from elephant ivory. So I think the lairds were living in this house at the end. Now, along with artifactual dating, we're using a kind of geophysical dating called optically stimulated luminescence dating. And that is a process whereby you can date when a layer of sand is covered with something that excludes light from it. So what you're dating is the burial of something. And it's used in geology more and more these days. It's not used as much in archaeology. I think it will be over time. We pretty much have to use it because the 1600s is not a good time to use radiocarbon dating, given problems with the curve from that period. But we've gotten some results from our OSL dating that present us with a paradox. And that is, this is the wall of one of those buildings. And it suggests that the sand started to blow there in the mid-1500s, when this was one of Shetland's most prosperous estates. I wasn't expecting that. And in fact, when we got that, I thought there was some kind of a lab error with that. Now, something else, though, that's interesting about this view that you're seeing here is it's a test pit. And if you see the difference in the color of the sand from here to here, you notice this is a little warmer in color. I mean, it's red in these layers, but it just turns gray. This is the pink is from peat ash that's just distributed in the sand. And what this really shows is that people were using this house or were living here until the sand had accumulated to the eaves of the house, you know, right to the wall tops before they left. By the way, 1730, that makes sense in terms of all the other dating. The beginning of, you know, roughly the beginning of the 18th century. We know when it was abandoned. But I brought the director of the lab back, and we did another test pit in this area to get another sample. You see, these are places the wind blows predominantly from this direction. These are like the lees of these buildings, and so the deposits build up there, and they're protected from the wind. And he did an absolute state-of-the-art analysis of it, and sand was blowing there in the 1540s. So, and yet at that point, that precise point, the governor of Shetland bought the estate. So we have a real paradox in the dates here and what we know about the environment. Another aspect of the story that has to do with the way the site was abandoned is that it's clear that both of the structures, the roof was taken off and they filled up with sand. But in one of the structures, they excavated out one end of the house and they built a little retaining wall against the sand that was in the other part, put a roof over it, and apparently lived in it for long enough so a packed peat ash floor about that thick developed. That's what that red color is there. We call it the last stand hut. And we really have no idea who was living there, but while we were excavating the sand, this is the doorway, we found that they had actually taken rocks at one point and put it in the sand to make it easier to climb out of this room onto the landscape that was rising. And that was that doorway right there. And so there's this courtyard in here in which, you know, originally there may have been wooden gates here. You could keep domestic animals out of it. But over time, it began to fill with sand. And this is that gateway. That brown deposit represents the last cultural deposit on the site before it was just buried in sand and never reused. And I excavated this area here, and this just shows how sand accumulated in the courtyard along with midden deposits. And when I excavated through here, I could tell the sand got more compact, and what I was looking at was the fact that people just kept walking over it, and eventually they were walking out of a gate that no longer existed because it had almost been completely buried. And another odd part of this abandonment sequence is even on the latest kind of midden layers, we find things like fragments of decorated wine glasses and lots of bottles that probably held spirits or wine. So was the climate cause this disaster, the little ice age? Well, it's interesting that when you look at sort of temperature curves for the last 1,000 years, on many of them, the last decade of the 17th century was the coldest decade over the last 1,000 years in northwestern Europe. But that's an association. It's not a sign of causation. I think it does mean that probably the lives of the people who were living there were particularly miserable regardless of what was going on with the geology. So we're going back this May. We're going to excavate more of the site. We're going to do more environmental sampling. But I'm confident now that this particular site was lived in by the managers of the estate in its late phases. And it looks like they were trying to keep up their image with limited resources, and were probably squandering a certain amount of those limited resources on that process of maintaining their own status. It's possible that the farm was buried very quickly in the 1690s, maybe just the beginning of the 1700s. And that was a period of very cold climate. But sand was blowing around there in the mid-1500s, and actually there was an earlier period from the medieval period in which there was some sand too. So we need to find out what this means. I have some ideas that are fairly simple that may have had to do with new people buying the land and forcing their tenants to farm in new ways that were not sustainable. And the situation got out of control, but then they were able to get it back under control for another 100 years. And then we have this enigma of this little hovel where somebody was living, and honestly, it looks like they had access to fine glassware and alcohol, but eventually they left. Now, another part of the project that we're quite proud of, and that is probably the most fun part, is that we have a variety of forms of community outreach. And there's a local history group called the South Mainland Community History Group. They have a restored 19th century mill that they open in the summertime. And we are doing oral history surveys in the area, talking with people who have farmed in the area. They tell us what it's like to farm land that has lots of sand in it. They're just an incredibly important source of information. And so this is in 2015. I took 2 Bates College students over, and we were doing archaeological survey, and we did some interviewing, but in this case, one of them is getting a lesson on the dialect words for all the different colors of Shetland sheep. We also have an outreach project with a local primary school, which is very close to the site. And it's a treat for me to see this school, because it's a well-funded rural school. This is not real common in the US, and it's been well-funded for the last 30 or 40 years. Frankly, a lot of it because of the North Sea oil industry, and more recently, the European Union ties. And the kids are just, they're so much fun to interact with, because they have this confidence and comfort in their identity that's great. Any of you know what Optically is? Yeah, we've just had a series. Yes, exactly. Optically is a midwinter fire festival, and it involves people dressing up as Vikings and getting very drunk and marching around with torches and singing songs from the Victorian period. Even the small settlements have their own celebrations. And so this is for the South Mainland. They've got their own ship, and they burn a Viking ship, and you see all the kids in their Viking costumes here. And the classes are able to walk over to our site, and we go and we give talks in the school too, but they walk over to our site and we let them excavate on sides of the site where they're not going to destroy any important evidence. And they get to see things like how to do digital mapping. And to give you an idea of just how local this is, the boy here who's holding this laser transit is from that farm. And in many cases, what we're doing we're interviewing the grandparents of the kids who are coming over to the site and seeing the work that we're doing there. And so as a result of this outreach work, in 2013, we got an award. It's called an environmental award from the Shetland government for the educational outreach. And this was in the Shetland Museum, which, by the way, is a fantastic museum. And we're standing in front of the type of boat that was used in deep sea fishing in the 19th century, big 6-oared boat. But these 2 guys are like the heads of the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency, but he and she are local volunteers who excavate on the site. These are teachers from the local school. He's the landowner. He's the assistant director who lives in the Orkney Islands. And it was really gratifying to get that recognition. So I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have about all of this.
I'm going to turn on the lights.
Okay.
So you speculate about the Sinclairs and Lairds. Has any of your team taken on the genealogical aspect and gone and pulled up the parish records and looked for them too?
Yes. And we work closely with the Shetland archivist. And so we have a pretty good idea of where they came from and where they went. The Sinclairs, what we don't have a good idea of is where their tenants went, after this happened. And there were different branches of the Sinclair family in Shetland, and we believe that the ones from Brew went and essentially moved in with another branch that's north of this area. And one thing I did not mention, I'm glad you brought this up, is that the whole question of whether climate played a role or a primary role in this disaster, the student who I pointed out was being given a lesson in Shetland sheep knowledge did a senior thesis in which she really cataloged all the information that we had about that family. And one thing that's very clear about the family specifically from that township was in the 1600s, they had more and more legal problems, and they had more and more formal economic problems. And so, at this point, I am wondering whether the real issue here was that at different points, they were pushing the land too hard for productivity. Either cropping, it's very likely they were actually cultivating oats and barley in sand at points here. But they must have had some sustainable way to do it. But I think you could see how there would be potentially a narrow line that you could cross when the system could get out of control, given it's a windy place all the time. I am not convinced that severe storms in the Little Ice Age completely broke up this landscape and it started blowing away, because there are hard storms in Shetland every winter, and there are titanically big ones every few winters, and this environment has not been disrupted by them. So at this point, one, we clearly need to get more information about the original landscape, and if we can get some more detail about the climate history specifically for that area, that would be good. But at this point, I'm thinking that anthropogenic forces may have played a bigger role here than the Little Ice Age. Once the landscape was destabilized, at that point, certainly storms would have just advanced the process and made it worse. There's no question about that. This particular site, we really hadn't done much excavation here, but this particular site is excruciatingly windy when the wind is blowing from the southwest and the west. And again, that raises the question of why did they put their houses there also?
There were very interesting parallels with the Goblin sands.
Yes.
I'm sure you're familiar with. Murrayfirth Coast, just west of the Finborn River, near Forest. The entire estate, the community estate, was overwhelmed with sand. The big blow was in 1694, which matches.
Yep.
But my question, in part it was man-induced. They were cutting and pulling the Marram Grass for thatch.
Yeah.
So, the following year, the Scottish Parliament passed a bill. It's illegal to pull or destroy Marram Grass. One wonders if a certain Donald Trump is been acting illegally, making golf courses.
I'm sure.
My question is, was there the same problem at Brew? People destroying the Marram Grass?
The question of the Marram Grass is one that's vexing for us because in theory, Marram Grass was native to Shetland, but it also has not been researched very carefully, and it would have made all the difference here. Now, if it had been covering this area, it would not have been a really prosperous property, though, because Marram Grass is not good for grazing at all. It's good for stabilizing dunes. But, as you point out, the Scottish Parliament knew that you could virtually remediate these situations, or you could at least prevent them by keeping it from being pulled. And so it's possible that might have, if it was growing along the front of this area and stabilizing the front, if that was pulled out, that might have opened up the landscape enough so that it might have been part of the problem. Now, I mentioned rabbits. They were introduced in the 1500s, and they may have played a role in this process too, because today the number of holes in that landscape is truly astounding. You can particularly see this if you are on a helicopter and you're looking down on the landscape, and it looks like little bomb craters all over it with gray sand in the green vegetation. It could have been, it could have been a synergistic effect of all of these things happening at the particular time period. We're pushing the envelope, though, trying to address this through archaeology. Archaeology is not the best method for looking at events, but we're trying to use it this way, and partly, I haven't mentioned this either, but it's to advance archaeology, because it's very likely that events have been very influential in the past, and I think we've tended to, the evolution paradigm affected the discipline so heavily, we've tended to look more for sort of slow-moving adaptive types of relationships between stimulus and response, and actually, catastrophes may have played a big role in the formation of adaptive strategies in the past. And we should look at this carefully, because it's very likely that we may see an uptick in these types of things in the future with climate change also.
In the case of Dublin Sands, it's not enormous forest, actually the Forestry Commission. I guess you don't have that option.
No. There are other places. In 1697, a giant swath of the Outer Hebrides, there were huge sand movements on the islands of North and South Uist that completely changed the landscape in 1697, and that happened during storms. So they certainly can be a huge factor, but I also think we should look at these places in a case-by-case way, considering the local circumstances. Other.
I noticed on the medieval map there's a kirk that's close by. I'd be very interested in looking at the life duration for children under the age of 15.
Oh, yeah.
To have a look during this time period to see if the kids were effectively starving in some instances. Obviously, if they're drinking wine and have fine belt wear, in Mainland, then it's obviously not too bad. But it'd be quite interesting to see if there is a pattern that matches some of these events that you see.
Well, the church that was described in that quote from 1744, it's there today. It's under a pile of sand, and
the church records would be moved, most likely.
Yes, and we don't have birth and death records, unfortunately. I wish we did, but that where the chapel was, and it goes back to the medieval period. It was dedicated. It's called Cross Kirk. It's a cow pasture today, and you walk around it, and the rabbit burrows. There are human bones coming out of the rabbit burrows. And I mean, what I would be interested in, if there was a really large sample, would be I'd like to see the condition of teeth at different periods, because one thing about this environment is, and all the farmers will tell you this, is people do keep sheep in this area, but the clippers get dulled very quickly, when they're shorn, because of the amount of sand in their fleece.
So Jerry, what's an
We have a problem with middens on this site in that we haven't found any substantial large middens yet. I mean, a lot of the site is still under, 2 to 3 meters of sand. And so one thing we're going to do this May is do some targeted searching for middens. But we find the usual suspects. We find fish, we find sheep, cattle, those are the main resources. What we haven't found, though, I want to widen our spatial sample, is the rabbit bones. I'd be very interested to see if they just appeared at a certain point, But the real problem is I suspected that this site was built in the 1600s, and these dates of 1540, see, they implied that there were buildings there that formed a protected lee for this material to build up against. And we haven't found any artifacts earlier than 1650. So this is one of those situations that can drive an archaeologist crazy in terms of it being a really big question and of basic chronology. And I suspect with some more aggressive sampling of the area around the buildings this May, I think we're going to resolve that this May. But it's quite dramatic, to walk into a building with the walls standing to your shoulder height or above and know that, that it was abandoned under extreme circumstances that long ago. And there are signs in the artifacts that give us little hints of what was happening there, and that you can find like a fragment of pottery, and one side of it, the glaze is all shiny, and the other side is all matte, and it's because it's clear it sat on the surface long enough for the matte surface to have been, abraded by the sand, and then it was covered up. So, it's a complex interpretive challenge. But I do hope that we'll be able to untangle the whole issue of causation. We may not. This was partly an experiment to see just how far we could go through using archaeological evidence, historical evidence, and paleoenvironmental evidence. I haven't talked at all about a lot of the other things we've done. We've done lake coring in nearby lakes. We have someone who's looking at the growth rings on mollusk shells to look at changes in water temperature. It's a complex project.